Hi, welcome back. This is the third and final segment of Leadership Alchemy, and today I'm going to be talking about action qualities. In the first two sections of Leadership Alchemy, we talked about the mind and the emotional qualities that leaders have that generate results. And while both of these are mostly the unseen qualities, we can't see the way somebody thinks, we can't see the way that somebody feels, but we can observe their actions. And it's the unseen, which is the foundation for the actions that we take, the thinking and the feeling that shape our actions. How change leaders see differently, how they're willing to imagine a new and improved future, may inspire them to take different actions than other people. We talked a lot about emotional resilience and mental toughness, which can translate into strong emotional reserves for that leadership behavior to develop that other people do not have. I'm excited to talk to you today about action qualities and provide you with some specific techniques that you can get started with right away so you can be successful. So with that, let's go ahead and dig right in. So I'm going to talk about 3 action qualities for transformation leaders and how they've already tied into what we've discussed. Transformation leaders are builders, they're navigators, and they're risk managers. And like some topics I've brought up, I could talk in depth about any of these topics. And my favorite one is risk management. But for this fundamentals class, I want to give you some practical ideas so you can start right away and experiment yourself. Let's start talking about builders. So what do I mean by a builder? In the broadest construct of transformation, builders are those innovators who create the future state. And in my seminars, I focus on transformation and deeply believe that skilled leaders are needed in order to build our future. So in the context of leadership qualities, I think of a builder who is someone who's intrinsically or internally motivated and takes action based on that motivation. So it's people who are action oriented. They see that bigger picture, the larger goal, and motivates them. And it helps them to contribute to that goal. And in addition, they often share their enthusiasm for this future state, and they're willing to mobilize people towards pursuing that goal. They're often really strong-willed and determined people, but they also are careful not to have blinders on. So if we break that down to what we've already covered, builders, they see, so that's imagination quality, and they envision the future. They're able to put all of those puzzle pieces together. So that's, again, another mind quality. Next, the understanding of the big picture or the future possibilities excites them and it motivates them. Emotional qualities. These are the strong-willed and the determined, which is, like we talked about, perseverance. They're positive and inspiring as well. Another category we talked about was emotional awareness. And this leads them all to take action, which they inspire and mobilize others. They collaborate and they build teams. So let's talk about 3 builder actions: building relationships, building momentum, and building credibility. The best transformation leaders can see the talents and skills that the organization will need not only today, but in the future. And then they work to provide those team members opportunities to build those talents. So share with your team members the qualities such as what we've talked about: being calm under pressure, providing compassionate customer service and support, rising up after setbacks, and your own values that are important to you as well as your company, and then provide people with opportunities and tasks that help them build those skills and talents. In addition to building their talent, transformation leaders build relationships for a brighter future and more complex and bigger projects. I often say that project management doesn't take a lot of talent. It can be done, unfortunately, with just using a lot of force. You can get your project done on time, but whether your customers will continue to use your product and whether your policies and programs will be adopted in the future depends on your relationships and how well you, as well as your team members, maintain those relationships. And as fast as change is happening in our world today, the change project you're on now is likely not to be your last. So, developing and nurturing relationships with team members, with your colleagues, with your suppliers, and then also with your customers. Building those relationships today leverages you for future, more complex projects, bigger, broader change in the future. And a key thing that is something I try to help people understand is that people will remember how they're treated. So if you're a transformation leader for the long haul, it's not just about getting the task done today, it's also about nurturing those relationships for future success as well. So let's talk next about building momentum. So how do you build momentum? If you saw my change management video, I talk about how the schedule becomes your bullet train. And if it's done right, your bullet train, the schedule, it takes on a life and a speed of its own. And a great place to start is to re-engineer from the end or reverse engineer your project. So what does this mean? So you know what the goal is and where you want to be as a result. And you may have some idea of what it will take to get that done. So if you start with your project goal and you estimate that it's a project that's going to take 6 months, you'll work backwards from there. Now, a challenge is if this is a groundbreaking project or a novel project that's not been done before and there isn't a standard out there. But in case of like implementing software, you may have other customer examples where you know what's a typical timeline. Or you just start with the date of the key event. That could be your go live date. Or it could be any type of date, a wedding date, a merger date, a new building opening date. Any important date, and then you start from there and you work backwards. And that will help you determine the plan, how much resources and time you may need. And then the schedule then becomes the boss. If you're able to manage that schedule and build the emotional commitment into meeting the schedule on the interim deadlines, that's how you're most likely to wind up at the end on time and when you want to be there. Having a drop dead date defines the schedule and it helps establish that project momentum. In contrast, a common method I see a lot of project management is to measure the tasks and the hours that's estimated to take and measure based on percent completion. And while that is a fine technique to use, often what you'll see is if a project is supposed to be at 40% and it's only at 20%, then they just move the date out instead of making up that time by changing resources or finding creative ways to making up that gap. And that's a surefire way to continuing to build your project to be longer, as well as building and adding in more to the budget. It has a ripple effect throughout the whole project. There's an old adage that I use a lot. You may have heard of Parkinson's law, that was work expands to the amount allotted. And the more time that people have to get something done, more often that's how long they will take. It's not laziness, it's just somewhat human nature. So as the leader, you define your dates and you stick to them. And this means you're going to have to push people, and many times they won't believe the schedule. But believing in your team and believing in your team's ability to meet that schedule is really critical, especially in the beginning. And after they gain more confidence in the schedule and in their abilities to meet their interim milestones, they'll start to gather that momentum. Another key thing is to measure what you want your team to focus on. So what you focus on is what your team will focus on. So whatever you measure, make sure that that's in front of them, whether you have weekly milestones, that you've worked backwards to set weekly productivity targets. Ideally, then you'll have your team members who will develop these within the construct of their larger timeline. So if you have the larger timeline, allow your team members to determine the interim milestones for themselves. Next, I'm going to move on to implementation strategies for building credibility. There are three main ways that I use to build and maintain project credibility. First, clearly define the expectations for your audience. What is it that this change is going to do? And more importantly, really what it will not do. Because your change is not going to solve all the problems. And it's important for you to clearly define those expectations, or your customer or your audience is going to define it themselves. And almost guaranteed, those two expectations are not going to match because it's a mental thing. Their perception of something is not going to be your perception or your knowledge of what can be accomplished. So bring it down to the concrete, like we've talked about. Let them see it in black and white. Let them see it physically, your reports, your diagrams, your puzzle, and help define what your change will accomplish and how it's going to benefit them. A really good, in your charter document is really good to provide, and or decision documents that have some of your key outcomes and goals listed. Another way to build credibility is to have projects come in on time and on budget. And you may have heard this term often as OTOB. And I have added another one in front of it, and I call it on goal, on time, and on budget. And in many projects, very few people actually think this way. But it's important for you as a leader to help people realize, being successful comes first. And it is an expectation that project come in both on time and on budget. Those are expectations by your executives, by your board members, etc., when they've funded a project. And many people think that these are trade-offs, but actually, to be successful, oftentimes it means, many times people think these are trade-offs because to be successful, we have to increase the budget and so on. But actually, the constraints of using on time and budget can lead to higher productivity, higher creativity, and innovation when individuals take those dates seriously. So meeting their deadlines helps to build your credibility. Meeting your budgets is also building your credibility. It's really, really simple in how it does this. But nevertheless, people are afraid of being held accountable to success. They're afraid sometimes of being held accountable to deadlines, and they think it's really hard. And I'll say that it is complex, but it doesn't have to be hard if you break down that whole project into manageable chunks and you measure your targets. Again, what you focus on as a leader is what your teams are going to focus on. So set your weekly targets or monthly budget goals or weekly budget goals and measure those along the way. So you'll have your total project budget and you divide it by the amount of weeks that you have or the months that you have. We call that the run rate. And that's the amount of spend that you have for that allowable period. The key is just like setting weekly productivity targets, set monthly budget goals, and measure your progress along the way. So let's say you have a total project budget of $1 million and you've got a year to do that. So you're going to divide that up and get to your monthly run rate, the amount of money that you're allowed to spend that period, which is a month. So that would be about $80,000 a month to spend. Now, you're always going to have fixed purchases that are going to come in at a specific due date time interval. So for now, let's just assume that we're talking about routine expenses per month, or maybe it's your labor cost per month. So if you go over your 80,000 and you hit 90,000 or 100, then you've exceeded your run rate for that month, and you need to look at ways creatively that you can bring that back down so you can make up that $10,000 or $20,000 difference. Now, this is a way oversimplified example, but the important thing is to measure along the way so that you don't get to the end of your project and you've got a really big budget surprise, or you get to the end and you've got a huge amount of the work that is also remaining. So you want to course correct when the problem is small and you still have plenty of time and plenty of budget left, not wait for a big problem to go off at the end of the project. Keep your commitments or fix the problems when you cannot keep your commitments. As you've clearly defined your expectations with your audience at the beginning of the project, the tricky job is to be able to deliver. And some analysts and sometimes even new leaders are tempted to say yes to the customer and then find them in positions where they cannot deliver. And it's one of the biggest challenges in working in today's really fast technology environment that there's so much disruption. It's really common for your customers, or maybe it's your audience members, to not know what they exactly want, or maybe they cannot articulate what they want. And more often than that is if they do articulate it to you, they're just going to kind of share a description of the status quo because that's what's most comforting. And it's usually something that they already have. And if you provide them with something that they already have, after you've put them through misery of change, in the long run, they're not going to be so happy. And I think of an example of a heart transplant and a surgeon, and they have to convince their patients of, because they've got a heart blockage, they need to have a surgery. So imagine if after all of that recovery and pain and process, the surgeon said, oops, we didn't, fix the correct part of the heart. We missed something like that. Or we put your old heart back in instead of a new one if it's a heart transplant. Going through that kind of pain and misery, people don't like to go through pain and misery for change that doesn't result. So it's really important that you give them what they need, not just what they ask for. So the next key action that I'm going to talk about today has to do with navigators. And the analogy here is you're the captain of the ship, the chief navigator, and you're the one who's going to plot where the team is going to go and how they're going to get there. And you can think of a pilot if you want, the same analogy. So what does it mean to be a navigator, and what are those qualities? Well, navigators are the people who see the end goal and determine the plan and the path to achieve that goal. And they're also able to communicate it in an inspiring and in compelling way. So how do you do this? There are 3 things that I use for navigation that help set rhythm, establish response times, and make sure for follow-up. So implementation strategies to develop rhythm. How can you go about implementing this? Well, navigators come up with a plan and they set that schedule that helps build the team momentum, as we talked about earlier. And the huge part of this is getting the team over that initial inertia, and that's the hardest part. When they can come to know what to expect each week, they're able to determine what they can get done each day. And so navigators help set the team's rhythm. And a very, very simple way that I have used this method is to develop a weekly schedule so that everyone knows what the team meetings are going to be like. And it's a very simple method to establishing a cadence, which establishes that rhythm. Now, a lot of meeting experiences out there are not very good ones. A lot of them are very mismanaged, and managing meetings is a whole topic in and of itself. There's a lot of good stuff already out there, so I encourage you to take a look. But just for purposes of today, we're just talking about the cadence that we're talking about. So on Mondays, I often set aside a really large chunk of time for both status review and weekly planning. So it's a 2 or 3 hour meeting, depending on your project budget, depending on the size of your team. And we come together and look at every single work stream and every single milestone for their status. And then after we review that, then we come back and look through all of the corrective actions that are needed in order to meet upcoming milestones and what major decisions need to be made. And at the end, we spend 30 minutes or maybe a little bit longer taking a look at, okay, here's where we are today and what has to get done this week or maybe by the end of this month. But then also, what are our milestones for 60 days out and 90 days out? That also helps people stay focused on what's coming, so they're acting or working in a very proactive mode versus reactionary, where problems are elevated and higher to fix. So Monday is planning day. And then Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, I encourage people to do work day, to be as work days, and get people in rooms, get them together to collaborate, get them together to make their decisions, to accomplish their tasks. And there's also a need to have individual team meetings versus integrated team meetings where more than one team needs to get together. Get these scheduled and on the books so that there's a routine cadence and a routine duration that people understand for the project. Now, you may have some complaints about how many meetings are on the books. And a common complaint that I hear is I can't get any work done. So I differentiate between work sessions and actual meetings. So meetings are held for strategy, for decision making, for including planning and status review, like your Monday meetings. But then work sessions are those operational sessions throughout the week where multiple people may need to come together for the tactical work, for the frontline decision making, for those transformation projects. How are we going to design this program? How are we going to document this process? How are we going to operationalize it? Nevertheless, you may need to look for times for your teams to get together. And another thing to balance with that is, where do people need actual individual time so they can accomplish their own individual task list? So ensuring that there's not 100%, you need to have some slack in your weekly schedule for those days so that people can do their individual responsibilities. And then on Fridays, I love to have a huddle meeting, a status check on what good things happened throughout the week, and really, really important to celebrate those. And what of our Monday goals did we meet? And if we didn't meet those Monday goals, what obstacles need to be removed? And then those are the things that are thought about in Monday's meeting for the future week. But it's important to take time on Fridays to celebrate what was accomplished. People are happiest when progress is made. And even in really, really challenging times, when there's lots of stress or lots of frustration, when people can see the weekly progress and they can feel those intermediate wins, those short-term accomplishments, it lifts them up, it galvanizes them, and gets them excited for the next week. And then they have the whole weekend to recover, family time, rest, those types of things. And they leave on Fridays in a positive mental state to bring back to the following week. Another really, really effective strategy is peer accountability. If you are a leader who can instill a culture of collaboration and peer accountability, your team's productivity will skyrocket. It's important for team members to know what they're responsible for and their dependencies on their other team members. So how does their own individual work affect the other team members' abilities to do their work? How does their own individual work depend on the overall time of the project and the overall budget of the project? So when people know their dependencies through clearly documenting the work, and also a big one is to focus on handoffs from one team to another or one person to another, and helping them to understand if they don't make a date or make a deliverable in that chain of handoffs, what happens to their colleagues' work? Does that individual know what happens down the line and how that has that ripple effect to the project. So helping people to know their own teams, their own responsibilities, as well as how it impacts the entire team is a really good way to build that peer accountability. A wonderful CEO that I used to work with always said, do today's work today. And if you can't make a particular date, or if a particular milestone isn't made up or isn't completed, do the team members know what it takes to get it caught up? For an example, if they're 10% off and a completion equals an estimate of 10 hours, do they work individually to get that back on track? Do they have to work within a team to get more people involved to get back on track? So it's that creative thinking that goes into peer accountability that helps people maintain their focus, maintain their momentum. So when you have your Friday check-ins, you look back and see what results were accomplished. And then another component to think about this, on Monday, agree what the consequences will be on Friday if those measures are not hit. Does that mean that immediate weekend things have to be scheduled to get caught up, or the following weekend, or some other technique? It doesn't always have to mean overtime. A lot of times it means an obstacle has to be taken out of their way so that they can continue to do the work that they know they need to do, and they have the capability to get that work done. But it's an obstacle that has to be removed. So is that something you as the leader have to get involved with, or can the team remove that obstacle themselves? Another really effective technique here is to schedule daily themes and fun activities. Gives people something to look forward to each day. We would have workflow Wednesdays and bring in pizza for everyone, or food truck Fridays where everybody took a break and goes out to lunch to a nearby food truck to get some outside exercise and to enjoy some fresh air. So simple daily themes give people something to look forward to, and it gives them an important mental break. Another key strategy for navigators is to define response times, or your response levels. And in order to do that for solving problems, consider both urgency and the impact to the project, or perhaps the business impact. So I define these as: urgency is the speed at which is appropriate to resolve a given issue. This is a measure of risk to the business, whether there's a temporary solution available or not. Those two factors help measure urgency. And then impact is the measure to the business and how many people it affects. So does it affect just one group, one department, one person, or is it an impact that has a broader amount towards the entire organization, a larger revenue stream, those types of things. So again, urgency is related to speed, and it's a measure of risk and whether there's a solution or not, temporary. And then impact is how much of the business is involved. So for high urgency and high impact problems, it's really, really important to establish an emergency lane for immediate responses. So this is who needs to be involved at the executive levels, who needs to be contacted. Think of a 911 process that you want to develop that shortcuts all the bureaucracy, shortcuts all of the collaboration and or consensus, and where an executive response needs to be involved so that there's immediate resolution. Another key technique is to know when to say no. And this is really, really tricky for teams to get their arms around, but it's also really vital for success. In order to succeed, the project needs to really keep their focus, and that means they've got to be focused on the goals that need to be achieved. And it's very common with projects to have lots of noise, lots of rumors, lots of complaints, and this can really put undue stress and risk on a project if it distracts a good amount of resources needed to get done. So two seemingly, non-important and for those seemingly non-important and non-urgent items that are brought to your team, the first thing is to triage it and really make sure that there is a deep understanding of the issue and to identify if it is truly non-important and non-urgent. And then a second question that I ask is, will this issue impact our overall outcome? Yes or no? And if we need help to ensure that the person bringing us this information, do they need to be heard? Is it just that they need to understand better, have their needs met through active listening, or is it a real problem that they've brought to the team? It's important not to ignore those incoming criticisms and or complaints, because if people aren't felt like they're heard, they're going to either just keep asking or potentially keep escalating, and that can also distract from necessary resources to get work done. So if it's possible for your team, a great opportunity here is to work with your communication experts or your marketing experts and really work to ensure that there's an active listening feedback loop to help provide information back to people who are bringing potential problems to your group. And these actions alone will help your own team stay on track, because there's specialized people who help manage the feedback, even if it is negative feedback. So now I'm going to talk about some implementation strategies for follow-up actions. And I look at follow-up because it's a win-win. It helps your team to stay on the path, and it also helps your team to gain credibility. So if the answer to the request that somebody might be bringing, some of that feedback might be an answer is going to be yes, then you want to state what you're going to do and when are you going to do it. The fix or the resolution needs to be also scheduled so that you have that follow-up there. When I worked for a software company, our role was to respond to customer emails within 24 hours. And sometimes that wasn't possible to give them an answer within those 24 hours. So what we would say is we'll give them an interim date, or I'll get back to you next Tuesday, I'll get back to you in 2 weeks, and then when that actual resolution will be available to give them. And it's important discipline to help build among the culture of your team members to schedule that follow-up. If they tell people it's going to be 2 weeks, then put it on your calendar for in 2 weeks I'm going to call customer A back. And scheduling it puts it into the commitment as part of their task that they're also going to get done. So follow-up is a habit, and it's really rare. There are people who routinely follow up. It's a big payoff for them because it gains a lot of trust and a lot of credibility with their own customers, with the people that they work with. So I encourage follow-up because it's a habit that has a really high payoff. Now, the third action quality I'm going to talk about today is risk managers. And risk management is one of my favorite project topics. And in the future, I may do more in-depth session on this one, but so much of transformation is about managing risk. And it's just the nature of the work itself, because we're moving from something that's known to something that's unknown. And in doing so, that creates risk, and it's not the unknowns that, it is the unknowns that are those surprises and those challenges that are going to potentially blindside you. So to help you with some initial strategies today, I'm going to talk about 3 things that'll help you with risk management. And that's to identify obstacles, proactively address them, and then course correct when they're small. So some implementation strategies for identifying obstacles. As I mentioned earlier, it's not what you know that creates the risk, it's those unknowns that create the risk. And you as the leader can't know everything. You don't have ability to have your eyes and ears on all of the potential problems that could come up. So you want to teach your team members to be those eyes and ears along with you. And at a company I worked for, we called this smelling smoke. So before there's an actual fire, helping people to learn what those early warning signs are, the smoke, before there's fire, so that this is something that can be addressed. And smelling smoke or learning to be proactive and looking for early warning signs is a skill that can be taught. And most people are often so focused on their day to day work that they don't pay attention as much to future problems. So, if you can make it part of your culture and have it be a value that people strive for within your organization, it can really benefit your team momentum as well as your team productivity. And it's important to have it be part of the culture to raise these things early and often versus having something that people are afraid of raising problems and having that they may be blamed for it. So you want to minimize that fear and blame and actively establish a culture of looking for early warning signs. Another technique for risk management is to balance collaboration with contribution. So, how do you teach that it's okay for someone to ask for help? Certain people avoid asking for help and they see it as a negative on their ability to bring something that they cannot do by themselves. But as we work in more complex environments today, and as we have more disruption, many times independent work or solo work is much less and more integrated and collaborative, and complex work is more common. So as a result, it's important to have people feel like they can raise certain issues and ask for help. And sometimes key issues or problems can go unnoticed if that problem isn't lifted up to the surface, and then it's a bigger problem when it's exploded. And then there's a flip side to how do you also then encourage individual thinking and creative experimentation to learn and independently solve problems. And if you have a new person to the team who's always asking for help, that person isn't developing the self-reliance that you want for them to be a strong team member that works with other people. And they may not be developing the deep thinking skills that they need in order to tackle more complex problems in the future. So, how do you balance these two things as a leader? How do you help make sure people don't waste too much time spinning their wheels because they won't ask for help? But then also, how do you help them build self-reliance? So it's in that balance of support and creative learning. And if you, as a leader, are always stepping in and solving your team's problems, then you are not staying strategic. You're not getting your own work done. And you're also probably putting a maximum barrier on the effectiveness that you can produce and provide for your organization as well. So a common yardstick that I use, and you can try out and see if it works for you, is to ask if the problem that's being raised is a standard one or is it a unique and a novel one, never been seen before. So for standard problems, those issues, challenges that new people always have to learn and that you know they need to figure it out themselves, it's okay to let your team members struggle a bit. If you feel like it's important to assign them a mentor to make sure they still feel very supported, but also making sure that the staff member is still responsible for that activity and for that learning. And in the second case, when there's unique problems that arise, I like to use a good practice of getting more people involved in figuring it out as a team activity. Because then you're not lifting up just one person, but the whole team is learning together. And as they try one thing out, they find out what may work for the future. And so as a group, they're lifting the lid on themselves, if you will. They're improving their productivity, not just for today, but also for the future. A third item for risk management is to proactively address actions. So if you can do one thing to help your project stay on time and on budget, it is to build slack in both the schedule and in the budget at the front end of when you're defining your work. Unforeseen things are going to happen. It's just a given. We can't predict everything in the future with great accuracy. So you need the money and you need the flexibility and time in order to fix them. And just this one technique alone is going to be critical for assisting you in coming in on time and on budget. And secondly, you want to fix problems when they're small. Now, there's a caveat to this one. Many people are very, very busy, and by nature, the busier we are, the more we tend to be in a reactionary mode versus in a proactive mode. And sometimes bringing things up as risks or problems can develop a perception from other people of the sky is falling, this person is always has the chicken little attitude. And I'll tell you, I think that I've fallen into this trap in my career, is giving off the impression and of that sky is falling impression. And clearly, it's so important. Not every problem is a disaster. And I think that it's important for me to continue to look on how do I communicate so I don't come across too intense, or that I don't irritate people when I'm lifting up problems that clearly need early correction. It's just that my passion has been that since I've lived through painful disasters, it makes me want to ensure other people don't suffer around me. And the reality is that while I may feel that way, some people may not want to hear it. So it's helpful to kind of describe problems in a way that's easier and cheaper to fix, to avoid letting the problem fester. Because if we're too passive about it, that can create a larger and more complex problem to fix. So this is a challenge that I continue to deal with, and I challenge you to do some creative thinking on this, is how do you teach proactivity without a doomsday attitude? I don't have a silver bullet here. It's something that I continue to work on myself. And maybe sometime we'll do a Zoom interactive session on this topic alone, because it's not easy. Problems, and certainly because most people and certainly most executives are too busy for small problems. So the only takeaway that I want to share with you here is, I think a better approach, and I'm going to talk more about this in my next series on leadership competencies, a better approach is to teach prevention, teach problem prevention where possible, and to help people focus on avoiding problems, avoiding risk through automated processes, through automatic checkpoints, to make sure that we minimize errors and we prevent mistakes as a team. So when you do have projects that are not going as planned and they're off track, change leaders have to be willing to engage deeper in those situations when things start to really get crazy. So to manage risk, you want to get things back on track as soon as possible. And a common measuring stick for this is a stoplight approach, using colors of red, yellow, and green to help measure whether the project has to actually stop, whether we proceed with caution, or do we continue to proceed as planned. And that's a very, very good one, because it helps people focus on the reds, the visual. It's a very visual, red being off track and something needs to be fixed. We have to stop and course correct. So that's a really effective technique, and it's really good for your executives because they can just minimize what they focus on. Another measuring stick is comparing the actual expected work completed to expected at that time. And if there's a gap over a certain percentage that you and your team define, then what are those certain corrective actions that need to take place? Is it, getting creative around how to solve it together? Is it spending a little extra time getting it work done, overtime, those kind of things. And also as a leader, it's important to make sure that anything that is delegated, not just by you, but even peer-to-peer among the team, when activities or items are delegated, when you assign a responsibility to someone, you want to make sure that you're building in that accountability. And to a certain extent, it's not comforting or comfortable for people to feel accountable. So when it becomes part of the culture and part of the expectation, it's a lot easier for people to accept and for leaders to manage. So that is the content for the third section of Leadership Alchemy, the action section. I went over implementation techniques for builders, for navigators, and for risk managers. And now we're on to the final topic of how to make your own leadership development plan. And since you've made it so far in this series, I've added a surprise technique that I'm going to share with you at the very end, which pulls this all together and will kind of synthesize what the theme of alchemy is all about. So I do encourage you to watch until the end. In looking at what we've covered in this Leadership Alchemy series, we went over mind qualities, emotion qualities, and then today's section on action qualities. And all of these are specific to change or transformation leaders. And in the first section on mind qualities, I provided you with 12 practical implementation strategies for you to try out related to curiosity and imagination. And these are not just theoretical. These are actual techniques I have used in my over 20 years of working on transformation projects. So they're techniques that I like and that have worked for me, and I'm just providing them to you to see if they have the same effect for you. And then secondly, we talked about the emotion qualities, and we went through 18 different implementation strategies for you to experiment with. I spent the most time in that section on perseverance because change management projects are marathons. They're not sprints. So you need to develop your emotional resilience and you need mental toughness in order to succeed, not just on one project, but over your entire career. So hopefully you found some nuggets that are really inspiring so that you continue to challenge yourself to build that mental toughness and that emotional resilience. And then today we talked about different action techniques for builders, navigators, and risk managers. And I included 21 actionable techniques for you to try out with yourself and with your teams. So if you put all of this together, this 3-part series of Leadership Alchemy, there's over 50 strategies that are actionable and practical for you to try. And these are techniques, as I shared, that I have used, and now I encourage you to explore and discover how they can work for you and for your successful transformation projects. So now I'd like to challenge you to go back to the notes that you took in the very beginning of the first video, where you wrote down some of your personal goals. This is where I asked you to find out what you wanted to get out of the Leadership Alchemy series, and what were some of those leadership qualities that you admire in other leaders, and are those qualities you want to develop? And maybe you came across some new ones that I shared with you in these series as well. So change is tough, and for you to be a successful change agent for transformation projects, I encourage you to master the skills for yourself, and you have to lead by example and show other people the way. And as you become more successful at change efforts, you'll learn what molds you and what makes you better able to provide contributions, allows you to be a better leader, more efficient, more influential. Because each project you become more effective at change than you were at the beginning. And a phrase I use a lot is iron sharpens iron. Some of these change projects, they're challenging, and you're learning both internal things about yourself that maybe you didn't know before that particular project, and you're learning about your environment as well as your team members. So coming out of the other side of each project, you have transformed. Each transformation project becomes the transformation of you. So you see the alchemy theme here, right? I want you to take control of your personal leadership development. Let me tell you a story why. When I was a little kid, my mom used to take my sisters and me to the swimming pool during the summertime for swimming lessons. My mom didn't have the chance to learn how to swim when she was younger, so she felt it was really important for my sisters and I to learn how. And one day, I can't remember how old I was, 8 maybe, it was time for me to learn how to dive. And so the swimming teacher took me up onto the diving board and he told me what to do and even showed me how to do it. But when it came time for me to dive, he grabbed onto my ankles. And as I started to move, this really freaked me out. And in the middle of the dive, I just would freak out and I belly flopped every single time. And over again, he kept doing this. And I water up the nose and I was crying. It was a whole big mess. And I made up my mind that day that I was going to teach myself how to dive. And I was adamant that he was never going to hold my ankles again. So I had my mom take me back to the swimming pool and I practiced on my own until I got it right. And it really didn't take me very long. And by the time the next swimming lesson came around, I was able to dive and he left me alone. He didn't take me up on the diving board anymore. And to fast forward in the business world, sometimes don't you feel like people telling you what to do and how to do it are holding you by your ankles? That if you could just do it your own way, you could do it and you could do it brilliantly. I believe you can. And in order for you to do that, however, you got to take control of your leadership development. No one is going to do this for you. It's an internal project, and where all of this comes together, all of this alchemy, the thinking, the feeling, and the actions that we take. It's how it blends and shapes our actions. That's the alchemy part. So hopefully what I inspired you to do is to reflect on how you think, how you feel, what motivates you, and what inspires you to act. Knowing this will help you determine your growth plan and to be a more effective and influential transformation leader. So develop a personal leadership plan. Identify where you are today. Where do you want to be? What are those characteristics you want to improve? And of course, you can't pick all these things that we talked about in these sessions at once. So identify what's most important to you and know your why. What is the benefit of where you want to be? And that what's motivating you is really clear in order to make sure that you get to those results. What excites you about a particular competency? And what happens if you don't develop it? Okay, so here's your final exercise, your final technique. And I call this the alchemy exercise because hopefully this will all synthesize things for you. In order to make anything happen in life, to get any result at all whatsoever, it moves through these three phases that we've talked about: mental, emotional, and physical. Or you can think of it in terms of ideas, your passions, and actions. And this is a fundamental construct that I talk a lot about in my classes, and I will keep coming back to it. So I have used this alchemy exercise for myself, and now I want to share it with you. So the thought, the idea comes first. And what is it that you want to strengthen? Or what is it that you want to improve? Say it's perseverance. Come up with a mantra that you like, something that's catchy. You've heard me say, grit, don't quit. I use that one a lot. And oftentimes I realize that the more I think about it, the more I begin to experience it, or the more I begin to want it. So then the passion or the emotion stage comes in. And a technique that I have used is to put my mantra to music, or find a song that mirrors that item that I'm looking into, like perseverance, grit, don't quit. And I used to sing this song. This is going to reveal a little bit about me. I used to sing the song from Chumbawamba called I Get Knocked Down. I get up again. I'm never going to break me down. So the lyrics are so fun. They're super, super catchy. They were a British band in 1997, I think. So I used to sing that over to myself. I've got to get up again, got to get up again. And that's so I matched my mantra to my music. And a year ago, I was watching a Marriott travel show and I saw this interview with Aloe Black. And he said something that had such a profound effect on me. He said something to the effect, I don't think this is a direct quote, but something to the effect that music helps us metabolize emotions. And I think that that is a powerful, powerful phrase, or the essence of that, of what he said. And I was shocked. It's so beautiful and so powerful, this concept. And when I heard that for the first time, it was a real epiphany for me. It's like, well, that's what I've been doing is I take my mantra and I put it to music, and it helps metabolize it. It helps me process it so that I can do the third step, which is to take action. And I have done this a lot. I have put my music and my mantra together, and I move around and I dance to it, especially if it's a song on the radio or on Sirius. But you don't have to use dance if that's not your thing. That's totally fine. I will tell you when I'm doing my dancing, nobody's seeing me when I'm doing it. But you can put your mantra to your run or into your walk, anything that's got a beat or a rhythm that you can just repeat over and over in your head. And I think that what you'll find is that with the movement, it starts to take on its own life. And the greatest ideas and the greatest passions are not going to be achieved without action. So you have to take your action. I know this for sure. So the challenge that most of us have, I certainly do it, is not what action, but like the how, not knowing the how to proceed. And one leader that I worked with for many, many years, she used to talk about visualizing it as a staircase. You don't have to know how to get to the top. You just have to know how to take that next step. The very next step. Just focus on how do I figure out that very next step. And when you put all of your focus and all of your energy into that one next step, you keep it small, and over time, you're going to have a big, big, big payoff. You repeat your small steps, and in the end, you've accomplished the goal that you've wanted. So that's it for our Leadership Alchemy series. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I hope that you found some ideas and inspiration that you're willing to try it yourself. My next session is going to be on leadership competencies. I'm going to do a deeper dive into 4 areas: problem solving, relationship building, communications, and decision making. As we move more and more into transformation projects, working within your team and developing great relationships with team members is really critical. So I would love to hear from you. If you want to go to my website and sign up on my contact page, I can keep in touch with you. So this is MJ Reiners from Summerland Education, shedding light so that you can go from "that's impossible" to "what's next?"